Skyfall, movie review. So this is a 2012 James Bond movie starring Daniel Craig. I've talked a bit about James Bond before on this channel in the past, but I think it's useful maybe to go through some of it again because it informs a little bit how I came to this movie or what my expectations or lack of expectations were. I was a huge James Bond fan when I was younger, when I was about in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But of course, weren't we all? I mean, I think most boys at that age are big into James Bond. In my case, I wasn't allowed to see James Bond movies when I was younger, although I don't really remember being cognizant of who James Bond was until, I don't know, maybe about 4th or 5th grade, I started catching allusions to him. I think when I was growing up, or when I was hitting those formative years, it was between franchises. It was after Timothy Dalton and before Pierce Brosnan had took it on. So it wasn't as much in the cultural air as he might have been in different years. But I eventually became cognizant of him, and the concept of a spy intrigued me, as it does for most boys. My parents were a bit on the conservative side, so what I watched on TV was closely monitored. I wasn't allowed to see James Bond at a very young age, but around 11, 6th grade, I think, the You Only Live Twice was being shown on ABC as the ABC Sunday night movie. So people of a certain age will perhaps remember the ABC Sunday night movie and what a big deal it was, or what a big deal ABC tried to make it into. Where it was hyped up in the papers, and it was like this big movie event, and you sat down with the popcorn, and the first maybe half hour was no commercial breaks, but then as you got closer and closer to the end of the movie, there were more and more commercial breaks all the time because, as my mom put it, well, they know you're hooked at this point. You're not going to turn off the TV without seeing how it ends. But anyways, You Only Live Twice, I saw it in the early 90s. The movie, of course, is from the 60s, so it was dated even by the time I saw it, but I absolutely fell in love with it. I mean, it struck me as having everything cool you could possibly imagine all crammed into one movie. It had all sorts of fist fights and gun fights, and it had ninjas, and it had a lake with piranhas in it, and it had sumo wrestling fights, and it had plane flights and a helicopter with missile fights, and it had a giant it would outer space and rockets and this villain's lair in a volcano cave. And just, I mean, I think perhaps the pacing of those 1960s James Bond movies is a bit off by modern standards, although not by much. They've aged pretty well. But the concepts of those movies are just as fresh and wonderfully bizarre now as they were when they were first made. It seemed to have everything an 11-year-old boy would fall in love with. And I completely fell in love with the franchise. And then when I was in 7th and 8th grade, TBS and TNT on the basic cable package used to rerun a lot of the old James Bond movies. I think they called it 7 Nights of 007, where every night they would show 2 James Bond movies. And I would, when they were doing the marathon, I would try and watch them all. And, you know, eventually saw, I think, all or almost all of I definitely saw all of the Sean Connery Bonds, some of them several times. I think I've seen all of the Roger Moore ones. But, yeah, just really loved those movies when I was younger, and then grew out of it, as you do. And also, hit a point maybe where I was beginning to get a little bit bored with the franchise. And thinking, okay, why are we still making James Bond movies? What's the point? The Cold War is over. These movies are not as interesting or fresh as they once were. What's the point of just continuing to trot James Bond out again? And that was my attitude when this movie came out. And I even told the people around me, I said, I'm not going to bother seeing it. But then I was home for Christmas, and during the Christmas break, my parents were going out to see it, and they invited me along. And I said, well, sure, why not? Even though I had told all my friends I wasn't going to see it, I didn't mean I was going to turn down an invitation. What I meant, really, was I wasn't going to go out of my way to see it. Not that I was boycotting it or anything. Because when it comes right down to it, James Bond, at its worst, the series just degenerates into generic action flicks. But a generic action flick can still be pretty good. Or it's a pleasant waste of time. So I went along to see it. And yes, the problem with this movie, I think, is that it's becoming very obvious at this point that the James Bond franchise is running out of ideas. I mean, this was 23 movies in. The original source material, the Ian Fleming novels, got used up a long time ago. So we've been running on post-Ian Fleming ideas for a long time, and this seems to me like it's just recycling a bunch of ideas. For example, James Bond fighting a rogue MI6 agent. We've seen that one before. That one was in GoldenEye. Or James Bond gets an injury in the beginning of the movie and he has trouble recovering for the rest of the movie. And that brings in the question of James Bond aging. Well, we've seen that before. That was in The World Is Not Enough. Or what about James Bond is killed right before the opening credits, but then later it turns out he's not dead at all? Well, we've seen that one before. That was in You Only Live Twice. I have also a friend and fellow blogger, Whiskey Prager, and I'll link his review in the description down below as well as my own. He picked up on some things in this movie I didn't pick up on. Notably, that motorcycle race over the rooftops of Cairo has also been done before in one of the Pierce Brosnan-inspired video games. So not in a movie, but it was in one of the video games. I forget the name of the video game he mentioned. And he was even of the opinion that that final shot where James Bond gets shot from far away was a nod to people who were familiar with the video game. In other words, the filmmakers knew that they were lifting this from the video game and were throwing a nod to people who had played that game. So, the plot here is, or at least elements of the plot, is heavily redundant. But of course, a James Bond movie has never been about the plot. The plot is just an excuse for the action, the girls, the cars, the chase scenes, the exotic locations, the casinos, the suave, expensive alcohol, and sophisticated drinking. And all of that is in this movie. So check, 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 and check. It's all in there. And it's not a terrible James Bond movie. Although, I thought the ending was a little bit boring. There were lots of big explosions, definitely. But the fight scene, I don't know. I didn't think the choreography was all that exciting. It just seems like a lot of gun shooting and stuff blowing up. Pretty standard stuff for an action movie like this, and maybe getting a little bit boring. I thought maybe they could have done a little bit more exciting choreography. Okay, so that's the bulk of my review. I'm going to go through it now and add a few more random notes. The Whiskey Prager, my friend who I mentioned before, and I'll link to his review of this down below, he mentions that the last third of this movie, where they go back to James Bond's childhood home, and you find out it's this huge mansion with an underground lair and a grumpy old butler, he finds parallels between that and the Christian Bale Batman movies. And I'm inclined to agree. This does seem to be like James Bond borrowing from the Batman Begins mythos a little bit. I don't know if it's the resemblance is unintentional, but it seems to be there. He also talks about the relationship between James Bond and the villain. And what were his exact words? I think he says it gives Ian Fleming's gay subtext, implicit gay subtext, a hard nudge to the explicit, or something to that effect. Now, I've actually never read the original Ian Fleming novels. One of these days, but I've not read them yet. So I can't comment on how much implicit gay subtext there was in Ian Fleming's novels. Maybe somebody could leave a comment if you've read the novels. But there was definitely a homosexual issue with the villain in this movie. That was very explicit, and I was a little bit unsure what to make of it. I mean, on the one hand, it almost seemed like it was going back to that creepy, perverted gay the villain as a creepy gay guy stereotype. But this movie came out in 2012, so I wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, no, it's not, they're not doing that. This is 2012. They're not doing the creepy, perverted gay villain guy. And I think the filmmakers viewed this as a victory for representation, having an openly gay character like that. I don't know. Again, let me throw the question out to the comments field. What do you guys think? Was this a progressive element because it was more visual representation for gay people in movies, gay characters in movies? Or did this seem like regressing to the creepy, perverted gay villain? I don't know. Another random note, the abandoned island they go to, where there are all these decaying, abandoned buildings, is a real place. And there was an interesting article on it, complete with pictures, that popped up on the internet. I think I found it from a link to boingboing.net. If memory serves, I found a link to it somewhere. And I'll include a link in the description down below. It's a fascinating little article about the history behind this island. It apparently was a Japanese, connected to Japanese mining operations in the sea, and all these condominiums were housing the workers and their families. And they have pictures, some pictures of what it used to look like when people were actually living there. And then the pictures of what it looks like now. And I think it's been abandoned since 1974, if I remember correctly. They did mention in the article some skepticism about whether all of the action scenes were actually filmed there, or whether some of them were filmed on a set. Apparently the decaying nature of these buildings makes them a little bit unsafe to spend too much time in. But they said some scenes were definitely shot on this location. So Daniel Craig was definitely there. And it's an interesting little story behind this island. So I'll leave that link in the description down below if you're planning on interested in checking that out. Okay, random note the next. How did the villain get time to place all those explosives in the subway wall? And how did he know in advance that James Bond would catch him right under that particular place? And how did he know that this would happen right at the exact time the train was coming through? That seems to me like a plot hole. And I'm usually not great at catching these plot holes. I mean, I tend to be the type of person who, if the narrative of the story is sweeping me along, I just forget the plot holes and I don't even realize them until I'm watching CinemaSins later. But this one jumped right out at me. This one was hard to ignore. Also, Q was doing a lot of he was spending a lot of time talking about leaving breadcrumbs that only Silva would be able to follow. But it was never actually explained what these were, how they work, and it struck me as lazy writing. What exactly was Q doing on the computer, and what kind of breadcrumbs could he program into the computer that would lead Silva onto the trail? I just thought that was a little bit lazy. That was never explained. Okay, another random note here. The priest hole. You know, these old and medieval houses, I could accept maybe that they had carved out a small little cubby to hide the priest in. But I find it very hard to believe that there was an elaborate underground tunnel carved through the rock. And that seems like an awful lot of work, carving all that through solid rock. You know, unless you've got a whole team of people working on it or something like that. But if it's just like the secret hole to hide priests in. And I hesitate whether or not to even bring this up, because the James Bond series has always been defined by these unrealistic villain layers that are way too elaborate. But of course, that was in the old days, right? That was in the campy days of the Sean Connery Bond. This is a Daniel Craig Bond, where the tone they want to strike seems to be a little bit more gritty and realistic. So I think it's fair game to complain about some of this stuff now, or at least point it out, that these elaborate tunnels carved through the rock don't seem very realistic for the Middle Ages. Oh, sorry, it wasn't the Middle Ages, was it? The Reformation era. Okay, another random note here. Ian Fleming famously said of Bond that he wanted Bond to be an extremely dull, uninteresting man to whom interesting things happened. Now, the movies always haven't strictly stuck to this, but I still feel that this attempt to give James Bond an elaborate Batman-style backstory is out of place for the character. James Bond doesn't need it. He's fine just being a boring spy with no backstory. That's my opinion anyways. Again, I'll leave it open to comments. What do you guys think? Okay, last note. I've had a friend, actually I've had a couple of friends who have pointed out what they seem to see as the misogynistic message behind this movie, which they paraphrase as, "Don't worry, everything will be okay, the men are back in control." In other words, you've had the women screwing up the whole movie, but then all the women's characters are sidelined, and we've got the men back in control. M is replaced by a man, and Moneypenny is now in an office job, and it's never stated explicitly, but it seems to be, presumably, she got fired or reassigned because of incompetence after she botched that sniper shot. I think that's what the movie was hinting at, right? With her being reassigned to an office job, saying, okay, you're no good as an agent out in the field. We're going to stick you behind a desk now. I don't think, though, that was the open misogyny was the message behind the film. Or I don't think it was the intended message, at any rate. It's true that Judi Dench's M character is replaced by a man, but it's not before she's given a hero's death by the script. Nevertheless, you can't argue that the film does end with the woman characters either dead or sidelined. So I don't think that was the intentional message, but maybe it was a little bit unfortunate. But while we're on the topic, I have a confession to make. I never really liked Judi Dench as M. I mean, I get the concept of it. I think there's some value in having M being played by a woman because it offsets James Bond's misogyny. I mean, James Bond is a tricky character to get right, especially as we're moving into more politically correct times. But I think the balance you want to strike is James Bond is a misogynist, but that doesn't mean the world of the movie's framing has to endorse his misogyny. So you can have him be a misogynist, but you can still have the framing of the movie be skeptical of his misogynism. And one way to do that is have him as a woman, because then it kept a check on his attitudes. Even though I found Judi Dench a little bit boring, I mean, I know she's a world-class actor and everything like that. I just found her a little bit boring as M. I found her a little bit boring, but I do recognize the value of having a woman in that role. And now that we've removed that, then it creates maybe more problems with James Bond's misogyny. Also, Naomi Harris, who's been playing the Moneypenny in this new incarnation, is now back to the desk job, which was, of course, the way Moneypenny was in the Sean Connery movies. Which is a pity because Naomi Harris is a very talented actor. And I'm a little bit worried that now in the future movies she's going to be in a thankless role. But yeah, we'll see how they do with the future movies. And I'll leave it here.